Margaret Whitmore was an 82-year-old widow living alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood. She was sharp for her age, but lonely, which made her an easy target for scammers. One afternoon, while she was tending to her roses, a well-dressed man approached her gate with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. What beautiful flowers you have," he said, tipping his hat. Margaret squinted at him. "Can I help you, young man?" "Actually, ma'am, I think I can help you," he said smoothly. "My name is Richard Langley. I work with Golden Years Investments. We specialize in helping seniors like yourself secure their wealth." Margaret hesitated. She had heard of such companies before, some were legitimate, some were not. But Richard was charming and well-spoken. He continued, "I noticed your home, and I assume you own it outright? If so, you could turn your property into a steady monthly income through our exclusive program." He handed her a glossy brochure filled with happy elderly people and promising financial terms. A simple investment of $50,000 could bring you a lifetime of returns. Margaret's late husband had left her enough savings, but she had always been cautious. Still, Richard's pitch was convincing, and the idea of extra income was tempting. After an hour of persuasion, she agreed to meet him the next day with a check. What Margaret didn't know was that a man sitting at the nearby cafe had been listening. He wore an old leather jacket, sipped a black coffee, and looked like an ordinary customer. But he was anything but ordinary. His name was Agent Michael Carter, a seasoned FBI operative working undercover to bust fraudulent investment schemes targeting the elderly. And Richard Langley was already on his radar. The next afternoon, Margaret arrived at a quiet cafe where Richard had suggested they meet. She carried a check for $50,000 in her purse, feeling nervous yet hopeful. She didn't notice the man sitting a few tables away, pretending to read a newspaper but carefully watching every move. Richard greeted her warmly and ordered tea for her. "Now, Mrs. Whitmore, I'll just take that check, process the paperwork, and within a month, you'll start receiving payments." Margaret hesitated as she reached into her purse. "Are you sure this is safe?" "Absolutely," Richard assured her. But just as Margaret was about to hand him the check, the man from the corner table stood up. "Actually, Richard, I don't think you'll be processing anything today," he said, flashing his badge. FBI. Hands on the table. Richard's face drained of color. I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do," Carter said, pulling out a folder. "We've been tracking you for months. Fake company, stolen money, countless victims. And now, you're caught." Margaret gasped, looking from Carter to Richard. "You mean, this was a scam?" Richard tried to run, but Carter was faster. He grabbed him by the arm and forced him back into the chair. "Not so fast, buddy." Within minutes, local police arrived, and Richard was in handcuffs. As they led him away, he shot a final, desperate look at Margaret. "I was going to pay you back, I swear." Margaret huffed. "Oh, please." After the police left, Carter sat down across from Margaret. "You okay, ma'am?" She took a deep breath and smiled. "I think so. Thank you, young man. I don't know what I would have done without you." "Well, I think you would have figured it out eventually," Carter said with a grin. "You seem pretty sharp." Margaret laughed. "Well, I'd like to think so." He signaled for the waiter. "How about a cup of tea?" "On me." Margaret smiled warmly. "That sounds lovely." And so, over tea and laughter, an unexpected friendship was formed, one that would last far longer than any scammer ever could. Margaret sipped her tea, her hands steady despite the afternoon's excitement. So, Agent Carter, she said, raising an eyebrow, is this what you do all day? Sit around in coffee shops catching con men? Carter chuckled. Pretty much. Though usually, it's not this exciting. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. You handled that pretty well. Most people panic when they find out they've been scammed. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. Oh, please. I've lived through wars, recessions, and my husband's terrible driving. A smooth-talking fraudster doesn't scare me. Carter laughed. He liked her. There was something sharp about her, a kind of wisdom that only came with age. Just then, the cafe door swung open, and a uniformed officer stepped inside, heading straight for Carter. He whispered something in his ear, and Carter's face darkened. Margaret noticed. Something wrong? Carter sighed. Richard Langley. He's refusing to talk. We know he's part of a bigger operation, but without more evidence, he might walk free. Margaret pursed her lips. That's unacceptable. The man nearly took my life savings. Carter tapped his fingers on the table. If only we had something to tie him to his partners. Margaret suddenly sat up straighter. Wait a moment. He gave me a brochure yesterday. Maybe there's something in it? Carter's eyes lit up. You still have it? She nodded. At home. I keep everything, comes with age. An hour later, they were in Margaret's cozy living room, flipping through the glossy pages of the Golden Years Investments brochure. Margaret pointed to a small line of text at the bottom. Look here. An address. Head office, 47, Oak Ridge Avenue. Carter grinned. That's our lead. He made a quick call, and within minutes, a team of FBI agents was mobilized. Mrs. Whitmore, Carter said, standing up, you may have just cracked this case wide open. Margaret beamed. Well, it's nice to be useful at my age. By evening, Carter and his team were parked outside 47, Oak Ridge Avenue, a sleek office building that looked entirely legitimate. But inside, they knew, was a network of scammers preying on unsuspecting seniors. With a silent signal, the FBI agents stormed the building. Papers flew, computers were seized, and within minutes, several employees were in handcuffs, including the real mastermind behind the operation, a man named Victor Hale. When they searched Hale's office, they found a list of victims, and Margaret's name was on it. Carter called her immediately. Margaret, you did it. We got them all. She chuckled on the other end of the line. Well, I suppose I can cross helping the FBI bust a crime ring off my bucket list. A few days later, Carter visited Margaret again, this time with flowers in hand. These are for you, he said. She smiled warmly. Why, thank you. But what's the occasion? Carter grinned. Just a thank you. You were a huge help. Margaret patted his arm. Well, Agent Carter, if you ever need another undercover partner, you know where to find me. Carter laughed. I just might take you up on that, Mrs. Whitmore. And from that day on, an unexpected friendship blossomed, one that neither of them had seen coming. Over the next few weeks, Agent Carter and Margaret Whitmore kept in touch. What started as occasional phone calls soon turned into regular coffee shop meetings. Margaret found Carter's stories fascinating, chasing criminals, working undercover, solving cases, and Carter found Margaret's sharp wit and old-school wisdom just as entertaining. One afternoon, they sat in their usual cafe, sipping coffee. You know, Carter, Margaret said, tapping her spoon against her saucer, I've been thinking. I could be quite useful to the FBI. Carter nearly choked on his coffee. You want to work for the FBI? Not officially, of course, she said with a mischievous smile. But think about it, who would ever suspect an old lady of working undercover? Carter leaned back, smirking. You're not wrong. No one would suspect you. Margaret's eyes twinkled. Exactly. And I happen to know that seniors are scammed all the time. Maybe, with a little guidance, I could help catch more of these fraudsters. Carter chuckled, shaking his head. Margaret, you're a troublemaker. I prefer the term problem solver, she corrected. Carter took a sip of his coffee, considering. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't such a crazy idea after all. A week later, Carter called Margaret with an offer. We've been tracking another scam targeting elderly folks, he explained. Fake charity collectors. They go door to door, pretending to raise money for disaster relief, but the money goes straight into their pockets. Margaret's lips tightened. That's disgusting. Agreed. We need someone to lure them in. Someone they wouldn't suspect. Margaret grinned. Say no more. 2 days later, Margaret sat in her rocking chair on her porch, knitting peacefully. A pair of well-dressed young men approached, carrying clipboards and wearing bright, friendly smiles. Good afternoon, ma'am, one of them chirped. We're collecting donations for global aid relief. Would you like to contribute? Margaret peered over her glasses. Oh, dear. I would love to help. Let me just fetch my checkbook. She shuffled inside, just as Carter had told her to do, and discreetly pressed the hidden panic button he had given her. Within minutes, a black SUV rolled up the street. Margaret returned with her checkbook, pretending to fumble with her pen. How much did you say I should donate? One of the men leaned in eagerly. Anything you can spare, ma'am. Suddenly, a voice cut through the air. That's enough, gentlemen. The scammers turned to see Carter and 2 FBI agents stepping onto the porch. The color drained from their faces. Oh, crap, FBI? Margaret smiled sweetly. Surprise, boys. The agents handcuffed them on the spot. Carter turned to Margaret. You, ma'am, are officially our best undercover asset. Margaret beamed. Oh, Agent Carter, this is fun. From that day on, Margaret Whitmore became an unofficial, but highly effective, ally of the FBI. She had found a new purpose in life, helping bring down scammers, one criminal at a time. And as for Carter? He had never expected to gain a senior citizen as a partner. But, as he often told his colleagues, never underestimate a sharp old lady. Margaret Whitmore had always been an independent woman, but ever since she started helping Agent Carter, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The thrill of outsmarting criminals, the satisfaction of doing good, it was exhilarating. Carter, meanwhile, had developed a deep respect for her. Margaret wasn't just sharp, she was fearless. She had a natural ability to read people, a skill that even some agents lacked. So, when another scam case landed on his desk, he knew exactly who to call. This one's bigger than the last, Carter told Margaret over tea. Fake antique dealers. They trick seniors into selling valuable heirlooms for peanuts, then flip them for millions. Margaret frowned. Despicable. Their latest target is a woman in your neighborhood. Thought you might like to help. Margaret leaned in, eyes gleaming. Tell me everything. Carter smirked. I had a feeling you'd say that. 2 days later, Margaret placed an ad online. Estate sale, rare antiques from a private collection. Serious buyers only. It wasn't exactly a lie, she did own antiques, though most were sentimental rather than valuable. Within hours, a reply came from an Arthur LeBlanc, supposedly an antique dealer. The next morning, Margaret sat in her parlor, waiting. Carter was in a black SUV down the street, listening through the hidden microphone in her brooch. A knock. Margaret opened the door to a tall, suave man in a tailored suit. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the grandfather clock in the corner. "Exquisite," he murmured. Margaret smiled. "Would you like some tea, Mr. LeBlanc?" As she poured, Arthur worked his charm. "My dear Mrs. Whitmore, I'd love to make this easy for you. No need for auctions or appraisers. I'll take the burden off your hands, $500 for the clock, cash in hand." Margaret gasped. "Oh, my. That seems generous." Carter, listening, nearly rolled his eyes. He knew that clock was worth at least $50,000. Margaret feigned hesitation. "Perhaps I should consult my nephew, he's an appraiser." Arthur's jaw tightened. "No need, dear. I'm offering a favor." Margaret smiled sweetly. "And I'm offering you a chance to leave before the FBI arrests you." Arthur blinked. "I beg your pardon?" The front door swung open. Carter stood there, badge in hand. "Arthur LeBlanc, you're under arrest for fraud." Arthur tried to bolt, but Carter tackled him in 2 strides. Within seconds, the cuffs were on. Margaret took a sip of her tea. My, that was fast." Carter smirked. "You keep setting M up, Margaret, and I'll keep knocking M down." With Arthur behind bars, Margaret once again proved that no one should underestimate a grandmother with a mission. As they walked down the porch steps together, Carter glanced at her. "You know, you could just retire and enjoy your days in peace." Margaret patted his arm. "Where's the fun in that, Agent Carter?" He laughed. "All right, Mrs. Whitmore. What do you say we grab some lunch?" She smiled. "Only if you're paying." And so, the unlikely duo continued their adventures, one scam at a time. Over the next few months, Margaret Whitmore and Agent Carter became an unstoppable team. From fraudulent charities to investment scams, they took down criminals who preyed on the vulnerable. Margaret loved every minute of it. But one crisp autumn morning, everything changed. Carter arrived at Margaret's house unusually early, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He knocked on the door, and when she opened it, he gave her a look she couldn't quite read. "What's wrong, Carter? You look like you just swallowed a lemon." He handed her a coffee and took a deep breath. "Margaret, I have an offer for you." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Oh. Is this where you ask me to become an official undercover agent?" Carter chuckled. "Not quite, but close. The Bureau has noticed your effectiveness. And they want to bring you on as a consultant." Margaret blinked. "A consultant?" "You'd be working with us, unofficially, of course. Helping us with cases that involve fraud, especially targeting seniors. You wouldn't have a badge or a gun." "Oh, darn. But you'd be part of the team." Margaret sat down, considering. A consultant for the FBI? At her age? It sounded absurd. And yet. "What do you say?" Carter asked. Margaret grinned. "I say, when do we start?" Margaret's first case as a consultant came sooner than expected. A retirement home had reported several residents losing money under suspicious circumstances. The FBI suspected an inside job, but there was no proof. That's where Margaret came in. Carter walked her through the plan. You'll go in as a new resident. Get to know the place. See if anything feels off. Margaret smirked. Carter, are you putting me in a retirement home? Temporarily. Oh, I am going to have so much fun with this. A week later, Margaret was officially admitted to Maplewood Haven Assisted Living. She settled in, charmed the staff, and made friends with the residents. It didn't take long to notice something strange. A woman named Eleanor had misplaced her credit card. A man named George found his account drained after a staff member helped him with online banking. And then there was Nurse Linda. Always helpful. Always friendly. And always around when someone's money went missing. Margaret played dumb, pretending to need help with her own finances. Oh, dear, these online accounts are so confusing. Could you help me, Nurse Linda? Linda smiled sweetly. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. As Margaret handed over her fake login details, she subtly pressed the tiny button on her wristwatch, a device Carter had given her to alert the FBI. Within minutes, the doors burst open. FBI. Step away from the computer. Linda turned white as Carter and his team swarmed in. Margaret leaned back in her chair, sipping her tea. Oh, Carter, you always know how to make an entrance. With Nurse Linda arrested and the stolen money recovered, Margaret had proven herself yet again. As she and Carter walked out of Maplewood Haven, he looked at her with a smirk. You sure you don't want to just retire and relax? Margaret looped her arm through his. Oh, Carter. Retirement is for boring old ladies. And with that, the FBI's most unexpected consultant walked off into her next adventure. Margaret Whitmore was officially an FBI consultant now, but that didn't mean she had forgotten her roots. She still spent her mornings tending to her roses and her afternoons sipping tea. The only difference was that, instead of crossword puzzles, she now solved crimes. Agent Carter had started relying on her more and more, and their cases were getting bigger. But Margaret was about to find herself in the most dangerous situation yet. One evening, as she was settling in with a book, her landline rang. Mrs. Whitmore? The voice was unfamiliar, low and serious. I know what you've been up to. Margaret sat up. I beg your pardon? You and your FBI friend, you think you're clever, don't you? The voice sneered. Well, you've made some enemies. If you know what's good for you, you'll stop playing detective. The line went dead. Margaret took a slow breath, placed the phone down, and calmly reached for her purse. If someone thought they could scare her off, they clearly didn't know Margaret Whitmore. The next morning, she met Carter at their usual cafe. You're being threatened? He asked, his face darkening. Margaret sipped her tea. It would appear so. It seems I've made quite the impression. Carter rubbed his temple. Margaret, this is serious. Whoever called you isn't just some scammer, we've been taking down some big operations. Someone powerful isn't happy about it. Margaret smiled. Then we must be doing something right. Carter sighed. We need to find out who's behind this. Margaret leaned forward. And I have an idea. Margaret placed an ad in the newspaper, a discreet message only someone watching her closely would understand. Experienced consultant available for private financial services. Specializing in high-value transactions. Discretion guaranteed. It was bait. And she didn't have to wait long for someone to bite. A man named Victor Moreau reached out. He claimed to be a businessman in need of an advisor for some high-stakes investments. But Margaret knew better. Carter wasn't thrilled. This guy is dangerous. Margaret simply smiled. So am I. Dressed in her finest pearls and a tailored coat, Margaret arrived at an upscale restaurant where Moreau had invited her. He was waiting at a private table, a tall, silver-haired man with sharp eyes and an even sharper smile. "Mrs. Whitmore," he greeted smoothly. "I hear you have a talent for financial matters." Margaret took a seat, placing her purse delicately on the table. Inside, Carter was listening through a hidden mic. "I do try my best," she said sweetly. Moreau leaned forward. "You see, I have a problem. You and your friend have been disrupting my operations. That's bad for business." Margaret tilted her head. "Oh, dear. That is unfortunate." Moreau smirked. "Which is why I'd like to make you an offer." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh. Work for me." Carter nearly dropped his coffee listening in the van. Moreau continued. "You clearly have a gift for deception. Why waste it with the FBI? I can make you very wealthy." Margaret chuckled. "And if I refuse?" Moreau's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then I'll make sure you regret it." Margaret picked up her teacup and took a slow sip. "Well, Victor. I do believe that's the worst sales pitch I've ever heard." Moreau frowned. And then the restaurant doors burst open. "FBI! Hands where we can see them." Moreau shot to his feet, but it was too late. Carter was already behind him, gun drawn. Margaret sighed, setting down her cup. "Honestly, Carter, you do love making an entrance." With Moreau arrested, the threats against Margaret stopped. But she and Carter both knew this was just the beginning. There were always more criminals out there. As they walked out of the restaurant, Carter glanced at her. "You know, you could have just let us handle this." Margaret patted his arm. "Oh, Carter. Where's the fun in that?" He chuckled. "I swear, Margaret, one day you're gonna give me a heart attack." Margaret smiled. "Well, let's hope that case doesn't land on your desk anytime soon." And with that, the FBI's most unexpected consultant was off to her next adventure, because retirement? That was never an option. After Victor Moreau's arrest, things quieted down, at least for a while. Margaret Whitmore went back to her usual routines: morning tea, tending to her roses, the occasional undercover operation with Agent Carter. But she knew the game wasn't over. Not yet. Moreau was powerful, and powerful men had powerful friends. One evening, as Margaret was locking up her house, she noticed something odd: a black sedan parked down the street. It wasn't one of Carter's cars. She sighed. "Oh, here we go again." Instead of calling Carter right away, she decided to have a little fun. She turned off her porch light and slipped out the back door, moving quietly through her garden. Years of experience had taught her that everyone underestimates an old woman. She was about to use that to her advantage. She crept up alongside the car, peering through the tinted windows. A man sat in the driver's seat, talking on the phone. She couldn't hear everything, but she caught enough. "Yeah, she's inside." "No, Moreau's locked up, but someone else wants her gone." "No, not the FBI, higher up." Margaret's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just about Moreau. This was bigger. The next morning, she met Carter at their usual cafe. "We have a problem," she said, stirring her tea. Carter leaned in. "What kind of problem?" She told him about the car. The conversation. The implication that someone higher up was involved. Carter cursed under his breath. Damn it, Margaret. This was supposed to be over. Margaret smiled. Oh, Carter. Nothing is ever over. He sighed. All right. We're gonna need a plan. Margaret tapped her spoon against her saucer. I already have one. With Carter's help, Margaret set the perfect trap. She spread a rumor, quietly, through the right channels, that she had evidence linking Moreau to even bigger players. Something valuable. Something she was willing to sell. The bait worked. A meeting was arranged. The buyer? A man named Lewis Harrington, an international financier with very shady connections. The place? A private penthouse in the heart of the city. Margaret arrived dressed in pearls and a tailored suit, looking every bit the wealthy widow she was pretending to be. Carter and his team were nearby, listening through her hidden mic. Harrington smiled as she sat across from him. Mrs. Whitmore. I must say, I admire your courage. Margaret smiled back. Oh, Mr. Harrington. I think you'll find I'm full of surprises. The deal began. Harrington leaned forward. This evidence you have, where is it? Margaret took a slow sip of her tea. Oh, it's safe. And the FBI is listening right now. Harrington's face twisted in fury. You. Before he could react, the doors burst open. FBI. Hands up. Harrington tried to run, but Carter was faster. Within seconds, the financier was in handcuffs, along with several of his men. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Oh, Carter. You do have a talent for dramatic entrances. Carter smirked. And you, Margaret, have a talent for trouble. With Harrington arrested, the threat was gone. Moreau had no one left to protect him. Margaret had done it. She had taken down an entire network of criminals, using nothing but her wit, charm, and a lifetime of experience. As she and Carter walked out of the penthouse, he looked at her with a rare seriousness. Margaret, you could retire now. For real this time. She smiled. Oh, Carter. Where's the fun in that? He laughed, shaking his head. I should have known. And so, the FBI's most unexpected consultant walked off into the sunset, ready for whatever adventure came next. Because retirement? That was never an option.